Hey guys, and welcome to the Lunge Lift podcast. Today, Ash and myself are discussing why Copenhagens are shit and why why maybe you shouldn't be using them. But we're going to go way deeper than just one particular exercise and maybe start discussing areas like eccentric loading, isometrics, and so forth that maybe challenge some normal thought patterns and maybe give you some food for thought. But before we get into it, a big thank you to our sponsors, always Wit Fitness, the home of training obsessed and the one-stop shop for your latest and greatest in fitness apparel, accessories and footwear. Check out the store at Wit House London in One New Change, St. Paul's, or the website wit-fitness.com and use the discount code LL15 and get yourself 15% off your purchase. That was read from a script, so hopefully I'm getting a little bit better. I still managed to ruin it. But, Ash, let's get into it. First, so I just touched there on what we're going to be discussing, talking about Copenhagens and why people use them. So maybe a good idea to be discussed what is a Copenhagen and can you give me ideas why people put them into their training?
Sure. So a Copenhagen is an exercise. I assume it was invented in Copenhagen. Otherwise, I'm not sure how it got the name otherwise. No. And essentially, it's a side plank with the top foot or top thigh supported on a bench or similar. Sometimes a partner might hold the top leg. And the idea is that it strengthens your adductors, which will hopefully reduce the risk of injury occurring. So less groin strains is the intended outcome for most applications.
Yeah, I've seen these done in the gym, especially when you're talking about like sport specific. You get anyone doing any sport specific training, and which I know we're going to dive into today a bit more. But I remember there was a bench in the Virgin that I was at, and you could have one leg under quite easily. And I remember when I've done these before, and this is why it's quite an interesting topic because when we started discussing them, this podcast over the last year and a bit has really opened my eyes to other things, but also it's made me challenge thoughts that I originally had. And with this Copenhagen plank in particular, I remember doing them, and I remember I always had to go from my knee, rest my knee on the bench rather than my foot, because I'd find the pressure would be too much at my knee. Because basically, if you imagine from my hip to my foot, it would then go down into like a slight V. So I wouldn't be able to hold myself up. So it was always an exercise which I never found comfortable. But I was like, so I'd get myself on my knee and I'd be like, right, okay, this is helping strengthen my adductor. And mainly because maybe when I was squatting or when I was playing rugby league at the time, I'd not pull my groin, but give it a little bit of a strain. So I started to try and think why. So I was like, right, I need to strengthen my adductor. So, and I know I'm not alone in that thought process. So, if you're straining your groin or something like that, maybe your first point of call would be, right, let's strengthen this adductor. But from what you've discussed, maybe we should be thinking otherwise.
Yes. So, well, first thing to say is that if you increase the strength of a muscle, it will give you resilience against strains more so than everything else being equal and having a weaker muscle. So doing strengthening protocols for a specific muscle will reduce the likelihood of injury to some extent. And yeah, the research on that's pretty clear. There's some specific research on Copenhagens and protocols that have Copenhagens or Nordic hamstring curls is the other similar exercise in my books, do show a reduction in injury for those specific muscles. But like you said, what I want to do today is challenge the thinking around them and ask the question of, can it be done better? And what's the logical thinking behind these decisions? And yeah, I think with a little bit of an alternative approach, we could get even better results and further reduction in injuries. So I think the easiest place to start is just the whole concept of training a muscle in isolation. So we're thinking we've got an adductor strain, or we're worried about an adductor strain, so we want that muscle to be stronger. How can we strengthen that muscle? And the whole concept of isolating muscles is from bodybuilding, where we're trying to build up one muscle more so than other muscles in the body, because the objective of bodybuilding is to have an aesthetically pleasing physique which matches certain ideals. And by its very nature, that means we are growing muscles out of proportion. We're trying to grow them in in relative proportions which are different to how they would naturally grow. We're placing more emphasis on certain show muscles rather than other muscles, which is a common criticism of bodybuilding as a style of training for the general public. So I think one of the analogies I like for this is we're chasing aesthetics and ignoring function. And if we think about that in another realm, it's kind of like a tailored suit. It's been designed because it looks really good, but it doesn't necessarily function very well or allow you to do so much with your body. And
what do you mean?
we were laughing about this offline. I basically learnt this the hard way at a wedding when I did a slut drop and basically split my suit trousers at the back. And it turns out that Rob has done almost exactly the same thing.
Yeah, lifting up the bride and then did it, not my bride at the time. No, not my bride at all. I was at a friend's wedding and squatted with them on my back as you do after a couple of drinks and split. Wedding suit trousers gone. So
exactly. So they look great, but they don't perform very well.
No.
And for the intended task of squatting or slut dropping at a wedding. So if we bring it back to the muscles, what are we trying to get those muscles to do? What is the intended outcome? So for Copenhagen, like they're generally used, like Rob said, in field sports. So if you're sprinting or changing direction, or like in a tackle in football is another common injury mechanism. So is the Copenhagen a good replication of the injury mechanism to try and strengthen the muscle in that way? There aren't many situations in life or in sport when you're lying on your side with only your top leg to support you. So on first glance, I would argue that it's not necessarily very strong in terms of replicating the situations and demands on the muscle. You're also usually in, not a great deal of flexion or extension. It's a straight side plank and some degree of either just a neutral leg or going out into some abduction, so foot going outside of the hip at most. But in terms of where your adductor could be in sport, like if you're playing a game of football, you're sprinting at full pelt, you could be swinging your leg all the way back, all the way forwards, and everywhere in between, because that's just the nature of the game and how you kick a football. So there's a lot of difference between the exercise itself and the intended movement that you're trying to strengthen it in. And I was actually teaching yesterday some of the gym box trainers, and one of the exercises I like to do for evaluating exercises is basically spot the difference. Like, what are the points of similarity and what are the points of difference between the exercise or the accessory that you're trying to improve the main movement. So if we're looking at sprinting and football, what does a Copenhagen have in common with sprinting and striking a football, let's say? They both use the adductors, so that's a big point of commonality, which is important if we're trying to reduce adductor injuries. But what are the other points of commonality? Not a huge amount, to be honest. Like, you're on your side, so gravity's in a completely different direction. You're not standing up, so you're not getting any proprioception of balance through your feet. You're not moving, so there's no dynamic stabilization and control. So it's like straight away we can see that there's a huge amount of difference between the exercise that we're choosing to try and improve the function of a muscle in a specific task. And I think we can apply the same logic to a Nordic hamstring curl if we're trying to improve our hamstring strength for deadlifting, let's say. Again, we're not standing on the floor, so not getting any proprioception or challenge to the balance through our feet. And the knees and hips are no longer flexing and extending in sequence. We're isolating one joint from the other. And again, gravity is working in different directions. So these are quite big, major differences in how the muscle is actually using. The muscle is being used, full stop, but I think it's actually got a lot of things missing in terms of effective transfer over to the key movement or exercise we're looking to improve.
Yeah, I just want to touch on a couple of points there, which I thought were quite interesting, because when we talk about bodybuilders and obviously building essentially a physique that looks a certain way rather than performs a certain way, is great within the sport of bodybuilding, but then as I say, utilizing maybe some of those exercises for a dynamic, functional, day-to-day use in a way, or sporting use, is just, it's really clear how, well, I think a really good example is you'll see a lot of pro bodybuilders rip and tear muscles, because as soon as they do something, like I can't remember what it was, like either Phil Heath or one of these big like Olympians, and they done it like getting out the car or something like that, or closing the car door and something like that. So it's like a real daily thing, because don't get me wrong, obviously they're assisted, so things are a lot bigger than they should be, and there's other reasons, but a lot of the time it's just a dynamic movement, maybe like closing or getting out of the car. Their muscles are just not loaded and they're not primed for that particular thing. So especially when you look and compare a physique of, say, a bodybuilder compared to, say a runner or a cyclist or a football player, look at their legs compared to, say, a bodybuilder's legs. There's massive differences. The sports person's legs are a lot more, they're made for the task. They're probably a bit more slender. You can see things are in proportion based on the demands of the sport. And when we then, if you say isolate things with things like, say, Copenhagens or so forth, is that really going to benefit you in the sport, or is it then a vanity thing, which I know we've touched on before? Is like, it's fine if you're doing it for a vanity purpose, but understand that it's not necessarily going to carry over. And I think just one other thing kind of leading on from that is, it reminded me, as you said, about deadlifts, and I know we've touched on this briefly between us discussing it, but I'm absolutely dog shit at doing lying hamstring curls. So I can probably do about between 30 and 50 kilos for maybe sets of 8 to 10. For someone that at the time, say, had like a 275 deadlift, so my hamstrings are clearly not weak. Oh, I'll tell you something I'm really shit at. I can't do a hamstring curl on the GHDs. So I cannot do it. So I have to do eccentrics because I can't get myself back up. So does that then mean that I have weak hamstrings? Definitely not. But that's the thing. Because I want to be able to do everything, I'm like, well, why can't I do these? I should be able to do these. I have strong hamstrings. It never really, I never understood why, basically. And then it was, and I know we touched on it and saying that we don't have to be able to do everything. That's why there's so many exercises out there, because we're all worked differently.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think of it as training for the test and being clear about what the test is. When you care about being strong, you care about your deadlift. You don't care about your hamstring curl on the GHD machine. But people conflate the two as if they're 100% correlated and very as important as each other. And I think that's a fundamental issue for why these exercises get promoted, is because in the literature, the main method for evaluating the effectiveness of an exercise is EMG studies, myograph, sorry. And it basically is putting electrodes on your muscle and seeing how much electrical activity there is, so how great the action potential for stimulating muscle contraction is during that exercise. That doesn't give you a qualitative assessment of the exercise. So when it's a full body movement like sprinting, how much the adductor is firing isn't the full story. And another quirk of the EMG assessment that I think is quite funny is one of the tools they'll use to calibrate the machine is the maximal voluntary contraction, MVC. And that's usually the highest score you can get from a muscle, is just maximally contracting it. So we're evaluating exercises based on how high they score on the EMG reading. But some of the highest readings come from just squeezing the muscle. So by that logic, if you're trying to train your glutes, just standing and clenching your ass would be the most effective exercise.
What are you doing now? 3 sets of 10?
Exactly, yeah. I'm doing it right now.
Yeah, I just did, as you said it. I was like, right, let's start going.
Yeah. But just that sort of logical critique, we can see that that's not a great way to be evaluating the effectiveness of an exercise. All it tells us is what it tells us, the percentage of motor unit recruitment in that muscle in that moment. But that isn't what we're optimizing for. We're optimizing for maximal force output the ability to handle and decelerate forces if it's reactive. So it's just, you need to take a step back and look at the bigger picture of like, what are we actually optimizing for here? We're trying to condition the body to be resilient against injuries. Okay, what are the mechanisms for injury? Sprinting and changing direction. Okay, so let's sprint and change direction. And if it's deadlifts and hamstrings, like how can we emphasize the hamstrings in a deadlift, stiff legs, RDLs? Like, there are so many variations that don't need to be so abstract from the movement that we're actually trying to train. And I think for me, to sum it all up, it essentially is training movements and not muscles. And you can bias muscles within the movement, but if you come from a muscle centric approach with no acknowledgement of what the movement you're trying to improve is, you're leaving a lot on the table, and the carryover is going to be much more tangential.
So obviously we're touching on like the isometric portion of, say, trying to strengthen your adductor, say with the Copenhagen. Now, if you take it away from the thing, okay, I'm trying to build my strength of my adductor, and maybe I'm trying to get it to be a bit more awake prior to lifting. So using it as part of a flow, going through different movements. Maybe you are doing some like dynamic lunges, and then maybe you're having an isometric within there, stuff like that. Is there not a case for that usage there? So if you struggle to, say, have your adductor switching on essentially, and it's something that maybe lags, is there not a case for maybe doing them as well part of your warm-up, rather than as a, say, I'm going to build my adductor strength there?
There is a case for using them in strengthening your adductor for sure, because they will strengthen your adductor. I think my key point for today is, can it be done better? And 100% believe it can be done better by making the adductor focused exercise look a lot more like the exercise it's actually trying to improve. So if you're about to squat, doing sumo squats, side lunges, anything like that, immediately you're standing up. So there's a huge amount more in common with the main exercise, and you're getting all the muscle sequencing to be a lot more similar. You're not just contracting your adductor inside lying with everything else rigid, when actually the function of the adductor in that exercise is to control, well, it does a lot, but let's make it really simple, control the frontal plane going through a knee and hip flexion like a squat. So if we can have more of those things happening similarly in that game of spot the difference, then you're actually getting so much more out of the same exercise. And we're all time limited, whether we're professional athletes or we're training 3 hours a week. So bang for buck wise, doing that side lunge is going to have way more carryover to what you actually want in the same amount of time as you would spend doing 3 by 60-second Copenhagens.
Yeah, it's nice because I know we've touched on pretty much this sort of topic before in one of our previous ones quite recently as well, when we were talking about like accessories, our accessory episode, and talking about like their carryover. And I remember I mentioned about bicep curls with pull-ups, and that was like the one there. But it's just all reminding me, because it's like, I know with all of my clients and stuff like that, I'll near enough always in there, say their warm up, their priming set and stuff like that, there will always be a form of lateral lunges in there, not Copenhagens, but there'll be lateral lunges, mainly because it's that thing of wanting to try and get your adductor to be awake essentially, because naturally from where we sit, everything's quite lazy, everything's like your knees probably fall in and stuff, it's just not really switched. Whereas getting into those, everyone always said, I can feel a little bit of a stretch into the groin, a bit of a strain. It's like, that's good, because just imagine if you was then running, say, for a bus or something like that, and you then I had to quickly get out of someone's way, and you push off that foot. Yeah, like I tore my hamstring by playing. So in rugby league, when you play the ball, it's literally just stand over the ball and roll the ball back with your foot. I rolled the ball back with my foot, put my foot on the floor, pushed off, and tore my hamstring in what it looked like in two places, the top and the bottom. When I showed you the photos, it was for me. If I can get the photos, I'm going to put them up on the screen now. Okay, but I'm going to try and get them. But because it's amazing at watching again how like from something so small of just literally just pushing off my foot and then just tearing a hamstring, which I thought was strong. It just, because again, you put it into, I'm very much standing on the spot, lifting something up, putting it back down. But pushing sideways, I just weren't ready for it. And
should have done your Nordics, mate.
Yeah, well, that's a different story. But yeah, I did try and do some of those posts, but yeah, it didn't really work out too well. So let's kind of bring it back to some of the stuff we've been talking about, back to the muscles, and understanding why we're training them, I think, is essential, which you've just mentioned there. And so when you start thinking about performance, whether you're training for performance, whether you're training for aesthetics, whether you're training for, say, just general well-being, I guess you have to understand why you're doing certain things. Like you said there, if you've only got 3 hours of training a week, then you need to make sure you're getting the most bang for your buck of the exercises.
Yeah, exactly. Like always be clear on what the outcome of your training is. I think most of our listeners would fall into performance category. Like everyone, whether it's health or performance, we're looking to perform well rather than necessarily grow our adductors aesthetically. if you do want to grow your groin, then yeah, hit us up offline. We can help you with that. So we're trying to get them more resilient and stronger for something, whether it's squatting, weightlifting, or sprinting. So simple check, I think I've said it already, like, does your exercise look at all like the movement you're trying to improve? Think of it like a spectrum of specificity, your favorite word. At the top end is the movement itself, and at the bottom end is something that looks nothing like the exercise. So if we're looking at deadlifts and we're trying to get hamstrings in, we could do a RDL, Romanian deadlift, or a stiff-legged deadlift. It looks very, very similar to a normal deadlift or even a high hip deadlift. So it's almost exactly the same, just slightly different timing of when the hip goes compared to the knee. Very, very specific. We're getting an emphasis on the muscles that we're trying to improve. One step away from that, we could look at things like kettlebell swings, single leg deadlifts, very similar mechanics, but different loading tool, less stable. If we go further away again, then we start getting into different exercises. And my point is basically the higher up we can stay up that specificity spectrum, the more carryover there is going to be. And we should only go lower down the spectrum if we can't get the stimulus we want at the higher end. So if we can't get the hamstrings to function in a normal deadlift, then maybe we go to a high hip deadlift. If we can't get the hamstrings to function in a high hip deadlift, maybe we go to an RDL. If we can't get them in RDL, maybe in a stiff-legged deadlift. And I'm just saying there are so many points along that spectrum that we could be operating at before we need to resort to a Nordic, that it's just way further down than we need to go for most people. And it has so many things that are different compared to the target movement that it's not an effective use of time, and the same or better stimulus could be achieved with a more relevant exercise.
Yeah, so because it's just making me think is where, obviously, say we've been talking about the isometrics, and then if we kind of bring it over to like the eccentric side of stuff as well. So obviously when we're talking about Nordics, so I'm not sure if we've already touched on what Nordics are, but your feet are essentially secured under something to lock them in place, whether it's on a GHD, lat pull down, wherever. Your feet are secured in, or someone's kneeling on your calves. Then your knees are on the floor, you're squeezing your glutes, and essentially you're loaded, falling forwards under control, like Buzz Lightyear, falling with style. So you're falling forwards, trying and getting your hands towards the floor. Normally you explode up and push up, or you just climb up however you want. So, but the idea there is you're isolating your hamstrings as much as you can, and just essentially ripping as many muscle fibers as you can on the way down. So this kind of touches back on previous discussions that we've had, where it's like building a bigger muscle has then the potential to obviously to generate more power. So because it has more muscle recruitment, more muscle fibers. So overall, it's surely going to be better, right?
Surely. So just before we move on, you just reminded me of something. So when I was doing some reading in prep for this episode, I wanted to make sure I was up to date with what people are actually saying about Nordics. And I found this great article citing the benefits of Nordics, some of which included tricep and bicep development from holding the weight at your chest, that grows your biceps, and pushing yourself back up off the floor. So it's also a tricep exercise. So I didn't realize it.
You're holding a weight, and then where does this weight go when you hit the floor?
Exactly. Yeah. I don't know. Maybe you're holding it in one arm and pushing off with the other.
Fair enough.
So super set.
It's rugby specific. Rugby specific.
It's actually rugby specific. I didn't realize it was such a full body exercise. But anyway, the other thing that was hilarious about this article was saying how it's so great because it works the eccentric phase of the contraction in the hamstrings. And they're like, just a little note for people who don't know what eccentric is. The eccentric is when the muscle's contracting as it lengthens, and the concentric is when the muscle contracts and shortens. So in a stiff-legged deadlift, when you're lowering the weight, the hamstring is eccentrically contracting, and when you lift the weight, it's concentrically contracting. And I just thought it was amazing that they're saying eccentrics are really useful. This exercise has an eccentric in it, but the example we're giving is for a stiff-legged deadlift, which has the eccentric and the concentric together, so you get both. And when you're using a muscle in reality, there's always both. And I'm being a bit facetious, and like there is a business case for overloading the eccentric because you can lower more than you can lift. But I think we just keep coming back to how is the muscle actually used. In very few situations do you only want to train a muscle eccentrically. For hypertrophy, there's massive benefits, like you said, because you can lower more than you can lift. You create more muscle damage, so the muscle will grow back bigger and stronger. But why would we only train the eccentric in function when actually the function of the muscle is to stretch and then shorten? Like when you're sprinting and changing direction, the muscle will lengthen under tension, but then the idea is for it to shorten and get you moving in the other direction. So there are very few circumstances where that's really necessary to only work the eccentric, unless you're working, like very specific situations. And I think for most people, running, changing directions and deadlifting, you can stay a lot more specific to the target exercise you're looking to improve.
I think a really strong case for, say, eccentrics within, say, keeping as close to the movement as possible would be, say, pull-ups. I think that on push-ups, they're really good exercises for strengthening the movement itself, because you're in your, say, your hollow body, you're doing exactly what you're supposed to do. So when someone hasn't got the strength to, say, pull themselves up unassisted over a bar, it's a really good way to essentially build up muscle fibers and potential recruitment there, and without using, say, bands or anything like that. So you can then start to overload that as well, and with weight. So you can, with this episode, we want to make it clear that there is times for isometrics and eccentrics, even within, say, performance, because, say, a pull-up is a performance of some sort, depending on your sport, but that's where it has a real benefit. So it can obviously help you there. So, and same as like when we touched on this before prior to doing this episode, and we spoke about, say, planks and stuff like that. So there is a case for planks, but we mentioned that it's like most of the time it's like, when are you holding yourself dead still in that position? A lot of the time you're just not, unless you then say, cool, my sport is push-ups. Then cool, that is your goal, that is your outcome, that is exactly what the intended stimulus to your training is, to get better at push-ups. So your plank has a direct carryover to your movement, especially if you're holding a hollow body as well. So then if you're holding more of a hollow body plank, maybe front support plank, you're in that position, so you can then start to think about your hollow hold and all these other things. So there's obviously cases for these, and we've, Ash in particular has picked on Copenhagens and Nordics, but they're just two exercises which I think when you zoom out and try and and you look at why, as Ash has been said many times, is why are you doing this exercise? And if it's to improve a multi-joint movement, ask, is there something that you can do that's closer to that movement to make sure you actually get stronger? And I think making sure that the outcome is the outcome, right?
Exactly. Always. I think on that sequencing point, it's really important that you, getting lost in thought here, I wanted to say getting the main muscles doing the main work is the main thing. So strengthening a muscle in isolation doesn't necessarily strengthen the whole system. And so having a stronger hamstring doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to sprint faster, for example. Sprinting faster is the best way to sprint faster. And the other common one that I see with this same principle is around rotator cuff injuries, where somebody injures their rotator cuff, they'll quite often get prescribed loads of rotator cuff strengthening exercises as if the weak rotator cuff is the problem. In all situations, it's actually the rotator cuff taking on more work than it should, because bigger, stronger muscles are not. So we're addressing this sort of micro picture of rotator cuff. If it was stronger, then maybe it wouldn't have got injured so soon, but the gross overall mechanics and sequencing is suboptimal. So actually getting a bigger, stronger muscle to pick up that slack would have meant that the rotator cuff never got injured in the first place. So it's that movements over muscles approach. Like, it's not just about that one rotator cuff muscle that got injured. It's about the whole system and how it's performing the task, whether it's kip swinging around the bar or doing pull-ups or pressing that's caused the rotator cuff to get injured. What's going on in that big movement that could be improved to deload the rotator cuff and prevent it getting overcooked?
Nice. I think you summed it up really nicely there, mate. So we hope you got some really good takeaways from today's episode. You know, as always, get clear on what you're training for. Keep your training specific to what you're looking to improve. You know, make sure you're focusing on movements first and muscles. That's Ash's new catchphrase. I like it. I like it a lot. And, you know, make sure you use similar movements with tweaks, which Ash is really good at, obviously, with his lunges and so forth. So use similar movements with tweaks to emphasize the stimulus that you're looking for rather than the other way around. And I think the most important takeaway is don't slut drop in tight trousers. So, but it's just a flashback. It was fueled by alcohol. So, right. Anyway, thank you very much for your time. We do really appreciate it, as always. Please share with someone you think may enjoy and get something from this episode. Do subscribe on YouTube, Apple, Spotify. And if you're feeling generous, a cheeky Apple rating and review will make our day. And if you do have any questions or want to be featured on the podcast, slide in our DMs on IG or email us at contact@lungeandlift.com. And you can get it in the description box there. But again, as always, thanks, Ash, for your time. Thank you for listening, and see you next week.
Thanks, guys.